Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm here for our weekly politics live stream with my pals and colleagues, Frank Wilkinson and Malika-Henderson. They are both political columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. And something just happened across the political landscape that we're going to try to decipher is probably too strong a word, but we want to take a look at that to the extent that we can provide any clarity to all of you about it. And then we're going to talk about where we are and then speculate about where things might be headed in the Trump White House and in the Trump era. A reminder to all of you that if you have questions, please post them in the stream. And our amazing producer, Mary Newman, will pluck them out of the ether and put them in front of us, and we will try to answer them to the best of our abilities. So, Frank, you in one of our Slack chats yesterday here at work posted a very interesting chart that I thought would be a good departure point. It is from AOC, and she's explaining essentially to the world through this chart. I think she posted it on Instagram. What happened in her own congressional district in New York, and what she heard when she asked voters who voted for her and voted for Donald Trump what was motivating them and what was behind that duality. And our listeners our viewers can see this chart up on the screen. But Frank, I think the core kind of synopsis of it is anti-institutionalism. They feel that AOC is against institutions and fighting on their behalf, and they have the same feeling about Trump. But you explain it further because you found it and shared it with us.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying in your introduction that we may not decipher what we would like to decipher. This is a pretty unsteady political environment. And I think everyone should be skeptical of easy answers, no matter where they come from. Honestly, the AOC Instagram post is one indication of why you should be. It's very complicated, right? People who voted for Donald Trump and for the, sort of signature left member of the Democratic Party. You saw a couple of things there. It wasn't just anti-institutionalism. It's also, you're both for the working class. You're both real. I mean, AOC's politics and Trump's politics could not be any more different, right? Even their aesthetic could not be any more different. Yet there are people who drew similar conclusions from both of them and think that they are likes instead of opposites. So we're dealing with a very unsteady electorate, a number of people I'm sure in AOC's district, as well as in lots of other American cities, who had voted in 2020 for Joe Biden didn't vote at all. So drawing easy conclusions from this, I think, is difficult. Voters are cross-pressured in ways they do and don't understand, I think. And I think in ways that we do and don't understand.
That reminds me, I was just thinking of this as you were speaking. I remember doing some reporting in Kentucky, in Appalachia, around 2019 or 2020. And a local politician said, who do you think the two most popular candidates ever to come to Appalachia were? And I knew one of them was Bobby Kennedy, famously. And I sort of scratched my head about the second one. And this person said, well, Donald Trump. And I said, I don't understand that. And this guy said to me, well, they were both authentic. Like, voters didn't care that they were rich guys. Bobby Kennedy was there in his shirt sleeve. Donald Trump, I guess, navy jacket, red tie, even in Appalachia. But that the voters felt that they were who they said they were. They were authentic, and that they were going to fight on their behalf. And again, like AOC, Bobby Kennedy's politics couldn't have been more different from Donald Trump's, but voters perceive them emotionally and symbolically in very similar ways. And hasn't that been true of politics forever, Nia, to some extent? That the emotional attachment can outweigh everything else?
Yeah, and listen, I think often that emotional attachment is built on something we can't even see or feel or describe, right? Some of it is charisma, some of it is fame, some of it is looks. You know, AOC, for instance, is, she is the singular figure in American politics. She's, first of all, one of the most beautiful politicians I've ever seen in my life. She's been on the cover, I think, GQ and Vogue. So there is some of that at work. And you think about Donald Trump has been famous our entire lives, right? He's somebody who was quoted by rappers. He was in, I don't know if it was Home Alone 1 or Home Alone 2. He's known for his gold toilets and beautiful women, wives and mistresses. And so I think sometimes that is the starting place. And then people sort of pile on other attributes that make it seem not so superficial in some ways, right? So you pile on, oh, well, they're really authentic, and we, once you sort of tease out what authenticity really means, does it mean celebrity? Does it mean this is someone I want to hang out with? This is somebody I want to date. This is somebody I would like to, sort of marry, that kind of thing. So voters say one thing, but I think if you are sort of to drill down on what are the real forces, sometimes they're much more superficial than I think voters let on.
But does celebrity convey trust? To the extent, apart from just the normal fascination people have with celebrities, political celebrity,
right,
and political attachments, I think, are at their core, an action of trust and faith, and in a world that I think many voters feel is closing down around them, if they see any of these people as a sort of guardian angel, that goes a long way. Or do you think that's too superficial?
No, I mean, I think people want to believe that celebrities are good people, right? That they earn their celebrity through hard work and through being good people, right? And some of that is at play. And listen, this is not to dismiss the real issues that voters have around sort of status insecurity. But I do think there are some superficial aspects of this at play here that are maybe not as complicated, that have to do with very sort of superficial and base level. Why are people attracted to certain people, and sort of the values we want to project onto people who are famous and rich that might not necessarily actually be there.
But Frank, I also want to get at something else here, though, that I think is bubbling beneath this issue of attachment and trust, which is anti-institutionalism, which is an old phenomenon in American life. I think that Trump is an outcome and he's an accelerant, but he's not necessarily a cause. I think he embodies a lot of things that have been lurking on the American landscape for a long time. So should we be surprised necessarily that voters are seeing two politicians of completely different orientation as fighting on their behalf, and that's enough?
Well, I don't know how many AOC Trump voters there are, first of all. So I think, we shouldn't assume that this is a vast sea of people, but you're certainly zeroing in on something that's real, right? And this is particularly relevant with, let's face it, low information voters, people who don't necessarily care about politics much until the last minute of an election, or where they catch snippets of it here and there. I mean, AOC was a bartender. Donald Trump was born into millions upon millions of dollars. They have very different experiences. AOC, in terms of being anti-institutional, she's not actually anti-institutional. She wants to overhaul the institutions to better reflect her values, but she is not anti-institutional. Donald Trump, of course, wants to blow things up. and see what happens, with no particular plan after that. So they're just in terms of their sort of intellectual commitment to their projects, they're entirely different creatures. And the fact that there are people who perceive them to be the same is problematic on a number of levels, just not only because their ideologies are different, but everything about their approach is different, and everything about their goal is different.
Nia, you've watched Kamala Harris for a long time, and you covered this campaign closely. If you had a magic wand and could sort of cast it back over the last year, even before she was anointed as Biden's successor, is there anything, one, you would wish was different? And is there anything other that you would want for her campaign?
Listen, I actually think Kamala Harris ran a fairly good campaign. She had 4 months to turn around a ship that was headed in the wrong direction and sinking at the same time. And so she was obviously able to raise a bunch of money and close some of the gaps that had arisen in the Biden reelect. And so, yeah, I know there are a lot of people who are sort of picking over the bones of her campaign, but I think, she was dealt a not great hand, which I think gets back to the first point, which is maybe if there was a primary, maybe if Biden had decided not to run for reelection earlier, and there was a process, maybe she would have emerged, maybe she wouldn't have emerged from a primary, but that probably would have set somebody up a little better to deal with some of the issues of the Biden administration. But I also sort of think that I'm not sure any Democrat would have done any better in this environment, this sort of inflationary environment, which I think really gets at a sort of status insecurity that people have. And that has to do with the economy, that has to do with sort of social instability. I think it has to do with race, gender, and class, essentially. And that's sort of what you ended up getting, a kind of perfect storm. And I'm not sure any Democrat could fight that. They're going to be possibly an autopsy report. There's sort of an autopsy report going on now with pundits kind of weighing in on it. And I imagine it's sort of all of the above, but even if you fix all of those things, I think that the environment was just so different, right? Where after a pandemic, Donald Trump is a singular figure, and Americans are dealing with these sort of crosswinds, both economic and cultural, that they're trying to make sense of, and that Donald Trump offered them fairly easy answers around this, and in some ways no answers at all, but simply sort of anger and bluster, and that ended up working for the majority of voters who went to the polls. Of course, some voters were so disengaged they didn't even want to vote. And Democrats will obviously have to see their way forward in the coming weeks and months.
Frank, sorry, had a bit of a cold, I think, today. You and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, so I think I can anticipate you telling me I'm wrong, but I still want to use this as a departure point. I think I sort of think of Harris's campaign as having these different acts. I don't mean falseness. I mean like parts of the narrative. She was the change agent, and then midway through, the campaign rolled out a lot of advertising around housing, which I think was a good issue for her. I think they spent around $225 million on economically tied messages alone. And then towards the end of I think her, very tightly run campaign, it was Trump is a fascist. And then throughout, there were other important issues being, I think, surfaced: abortion, race. But she, I think she, as Nia wrote, and we've discussed before, I think she intentionally was trying not to make it about that part of the election. But in the end, I felt the jobs and wages message could have been the tip of the spear in this whole thing. We know the poll said that voters cared about the economy more than anything else. I think academics and pointy-headed journalists equated the economy with inflation, and there was this debate: why should people be miserable? Because jobs are growing, and the economy is growing, and wages are growing. When in fact, though, working Americans have had now close to half a century of struggles to get better wages and a living wage, not even a minimum wage, better than a minimum wage, a living wage that gets them to the American dream. And to me, that explains a lot of why you saw movements like Latino men and Black men to Trump, in addition to sexism, in addition to lots of other factors here. So I'm not saying it explains everything, but I think you disagree with me. So I just want to put that on the table before you shred me.
It's actually not that I disagree with you. It's that I think when you start off in a situation, and we discussed this, if you look at democracies around the world, incumbent parties have just fared very poorly in this post-COVID inflationary environment. So number one, there's a basic structural environment that is not favorable for incumbents. Number two, you had the specifics of Joe Biden's administration. Joe Biden was not a popular president. He was down much farther, not just to Trump in polls head to head, but on those critical issues of the economy and immigration. And Harris actually made up ground over the course of her very brief campaign on the economy, and she even made it up on immigration, which is almost hard to believe. I'm not sure how she did it. But, if you compare the campaigns and you compare their messages, I think anyone would say, well, anyone who's not gullible to Trump's lies, which is, after all, what a large component of his campaign is. She ran a highly competent campaign under very difficult circumstances, put together under high pressure, brief time period. So her messages, look, I'm not going to debate when she shifted to fascism from the economy or whatever. Obviously, they're operating on their polling and their focus groups and their research telling them that that's significant at that moment. I think you do have to take a step back and say, this guy, Donald Trump's chief of staff and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs both called him a fascist. They didn't do that because they had bad hair days.
But voters didn't care about that.
They did not care about it. And frankly, I had a discussion with a Harris pollster early on, and I said, when you lay out his chief of staff, his cabinet members all think he is unfit for office, does that move voters at all? And, the response I got was, it moves some of them a little bit. I mean, that's the environment we're in. President.
But I also think, though, the Republicans benefit from a perception that long preceded Trump, which is that they are better stewards of the economy.
Absolutely.
Even though all the data shows that the economy performs better when there's a Democrat in the White House, going back decades. And then Trump himself had this, he's still seen by voters as a successful New York businessman, right, even though he's a serial bankruptcy artist and had basically been a punchline to jokes about the 1980s until he was on The Apprentice. But I do think The Apprentice positioned him as this can-do businessman. And the Republicans are seen as savvier stewards of the economy. And I think he benefited mightily from that, no matter what some of the messaging the Harris campaign might have done around the economy.
Yeah.
But you think this is too reductionist, Nia?
No, and listen, some of it is gendered, right? I mean, some of it is this idea that men are better with money than women. Cue the jokes about your wife with the credit card. So that certainly goes into what some of the perceptions were about who would be better on the economy, and of course Joe Biden was seen as weak on the economy because he was old. He wasn't a great messenger for the economy, and that had been in place for months and months and months, if not a year and a half, in terms of voters deteriorating faith in Joe Biden. Maybe you go back to the Afghanistan pullout, and some of his numbers started to crater around that, and gas prices, even though they came back, some of that was just built in. But I largely agree with Frank in terms of the Harris campaign. I'm not sure what you change over those last 4 months. Some people are saying, oh, well, she should have addressed the transgender ads. These are ads that were aired during NFL games and supposedly had an impact on the electorate, maybe primarily men, maybe primarily low propensity voters who are men. But I mean, how do you address that without seeming anti-trans? So there's this idea that, oh, well, maybe she ran a woke campaign. She was so woke that she was standing next to Liz Cheney for half of her campaign. So
the embodiment of American wokeness.
Exactly. That doesn't really track anyway either. So yeah, I think there was a sort of black swan, perfect storm event that the headwinds of which I think were just too difficult for any Democrat to overcome.
To move off of Harris and to move on to the Democrats' dilemma, which is how do you win campaigns? And they have in the past. So that's not to say they don't know the answer to that question, or they haven't spent a lot of time in the trenches figuring it out. But I do think, Frank, that there have been these huge economic changes that neither party can control, right? The shift from industrialization to the service economy, and the dislocation and the technology revolution, the dislocation in people's lives, all the opportunity that came out of that for some people, and all the dislocation that came out of that for a lot of others, including people who don't feel they can make a living or give their children a taste of the American dream. And I think Democrats have not figured out where they land with that. I think Republicans have an easier time with it for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into now. But I think that the Democrats haven't fully figured it out. And I think this is going to be their challenge going forward, is what lessons, let me phrase this. What lessons do you think the Democrats should take from what just happened?
Well, first of all, I think I would say more than anyone else, the Biden administration did figure it out. But let's go back a little bit, because I totally agree with you. I mean, Bill Clinton accelerated this whole process, right? Globalization, manufacturing leaving the U.S., and there was no
the college-educated class as a foundation of the party.
Absolutely, and stock market, soaring so that people who already have money get more money. There was no provision made for those people. Republicans weren't interested in it. Democrats didn't do it. And so,
and they're understandably pissed about that.
Well, but the Republican answer right now under Trump, right, is, well, immigrants did it to you, right? Immigrants and liberals did it to you. So that's a pretty easy answer. Democrats are like, well, let me explain how, offshoring, So I think what we had in the Biden administration was there's actually been some investment in manufacturing, and the green energy revolution created the opportunity for that, right?
But the thing is, those are long tail investments. The benefits of those were not going to be felt in this electoral cycle.
And unfortunately, that is one of the lessons that I think Democrats and others will draw, which is the connection between policy results and electoral success is not a straight line. And I mean, look at Donald Trump and COVID. I mean, he lied people into probably tens of thousands of deaths with misinformation and lies, tens of thousands of excess deaths, many of them his own voters. So the connection between policy results and electoral success is a hazy sort of ephemeral area. And that's a bad thing for democracy. It's a bad thing for government. And it's a bad thing for our politics. How to fix that, especially in an information environment where there's nonsense and lies flying around everywhere, is above my pay grade, I'm afraid.
It's not above Nia's pay grade because I know she knows the answer. What do you like? What at least leaps out to you as smart things to consider, even if you don't know the solution?
Yeah. I'm gonna say I don't really know. I think people live in these spaces where they believe that other people are living better lives than they are, right? And some of that is social media. You're stuck in your starter home and you go on Facebook or Instagram and you see, that your neighbor's moving to a bigger house. So that aspect of it, I mean, and I kind of refer to it as this sort of status insecurity. And I don't know how you address this anxiety that seems to be present, even if people are sort of economically stable. They feel like there's somebody else who's doing more better than them. I mean, the whole idea around transgender people somehow getting special treatment, right, to the expense of others. I mean, that doesn't make any sense on its face, but there is this deep sense of anxiety and insecurity around people's identity and around their status, and that is maybe that's ephemeral. Maybe that's something that, culture will sort of grow out of, but it's certainly the period I think that a lot of Americans are in now. And they saw in Donald Trump someone who has this status as a billionaire and a beautiful family and a gold toilet. And so some of this voting is sort of aspirational.
As Ann Richards once said of another politician, Donald Trump was born with a silver foot in his mouth. Let's look forward a little bit because we've gotten some tarot cards put on the table in the last few days from the Trump administration. Trump has famously said that he only picks the best people, surrounds himself with only the best people. And a number of our viewers this morning are asking about how to think about some of his cabinet picks that he's put out there. It's unfair of me, but I'm going to do it anyway. The last one I remember hearing about was South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who's going to be the run Homeland Security in what we hope is a pet-free space at that agency. But we also know Marco Rubio is going to be the Secretary of State. Mike Waltz will be the National Security Director. We don't have a Treasury Secretary yet. We don't have a Defense Secretary yet. We've got a Chief of Staff in Susie Wiles and a Deputy Chief of Staff for all known thought in Stephen Miller, which is so bookending this little row I've just put together with Kristi Noem on one end and Stephen Miller on the other. Frank, gives us a little bit of taste of where things might be headed in Trump 2.0.
Well, I think certainly the appointment of Tom Homan as the border czar, along with Stephen Miller as deputy chief of staff, you're looking at hard times for undocumented people. That I think is clear. And I had a conversation yesterday with someone who employs dozens and dozens of undocumented workers, who thinks that Trump recognizes that it would be terrible for the economy and it would blow up businesses like this person's. I don't think he's correct. I think Trump intends to blow up those businesses. And I think that is one clear policy indicator, is that with those two appointments, he intends to drive the hard line on immigration, drive an aggressive deportation strategy, and probably, frankly, an aggressive attack on cities that try to protect undocumented immigrants. On the others, everything from Elise Stefanik to Kristi Noem to Marco Rubio, you're looking at people, who are not going to resign on principle. Let's put it that way. They, Stefanik practically turned overnight her politics in order to be more amenable to Trump. Marco Rubio, as we know, has been humiliated so many times that I actually do wonder if he's not going to be appointed, and this is just one more effort to humiliate him in front of the world by Trump.
Maybe to see if he comes to the cabinet meeting with a little Marco hat on.
Yeah, look, Trump enjoys humiliating Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio doesn't seem to mind being humiliated time and time again. So, people whose loyalty is first and foremost, and will carry out programs that probably other people would not.
And certainly the foreign policy piece of it via Rubio and Waltz, at least, is probably, with a suspension or a serious withdrawal of aid to Ukraine, which Russia and Vladimir Putin will be happy to see. Unknown commitments to Taiwan,
right?
And maybe a U.S. withdrawal from military engagements more generally. Nia, is there anything that's left out to you so far? I thought that Wiles getting appointed as the chief of staff was actually a more sober-minded decision on his part than I would have expected, but maybe I'm misreading it.
I'm fascinated by the Elon Musk of it all, right? I don't think I think he's going to function as a kind of co-president. I think all of these other cabinet officials and chief of staffs, Susie Wiles, Elon Musk has apparently been down there for days in Mar-a-Lago, and I think he is going to have an outsized impact on the Trump administration. JD Vance has seemed to be kind of pushed aside. And so that's the kind of unknown factor. This is a person who, we sort of know his worldview, via his statements on Twitter and some of his statements more generally. But I think he is going to have an incredibly powerful role in this administration. He's not going to have any official role, but he will be by Trump's side, I think, physically, in text messages and calls, and just have a tremendous influence over the next couple of years.
And I think, we'll have to keep our eye out on, the attorney general is going to be a significant appointment, in the weaponization categories of the Trump administration. I think the Department of Justice and the U.S. military are going to be two prongs of where that might be the most visible. Dismantling of some of the legal architecture we all prize and are used to. But that's still, I think, too early for us to call in terms of how that might take shape. We're also running out of time, unfortunately, because I could keep talking to you two for another half an hour. But our little party has ended. Frank Wilkinson, Nia Malika-Henderson, you're both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. This has been our Politics live stream. We'll see you next week, and thank you for joining us today.